and refugee rights. We ask that all participants respect one another, even when emotions run high. This is a space for truth-telling, not intimidation. We also thank the Coalition for Immigrant Mental Health for providing services to all those that are experiencing any trauma during today's hearing. Today's meeting will include images, testimony, and public comment that may be difficult to witness or hear. Please take care of yourself and step out if needed, or seek the support of the coalition. Exits and restrooms are clearly marked. Let me briefly preview how this morning will unfold. The Commission will examine how federal immigration enforcement has escalated its use of militarized tactics and misleading narratives, operating with little oversight or respect for constitutional rights, inflicting real harm, fear, and injustice on individuals, families, and communities. We will hear testimony from 5 nationally recognized subject matter experts. There will be a break around 10:45, and finally, at noon, we will reserve time for public comment, because this commission also exists to listen. With that, I'd like to introduce our first witness, Professor Robert Pape, who will provide testimony to the commission on the following topic: when law enforcement looks like occupation, how the federal immigration surge and Operation Midway Blitz has affected Chicago. Professor Pape is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago and the founding director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Professor Pape will explain why the spontaneous protests that rose during Operation Midway Blitz and continue to erupt nationwide are reactions to perceived militarized occupation. He will also discuss how propaganda legitimizes force, why militarized deployments generate resistance, and when lies persist even after facts collapse. With that, the Commission is now prepared to accept the testimony of Professor Pape. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. This testimony is not about ideology. It is about risk and how democracies destabilize when federal power loses legitimacy. Chicago is not just another city in this story. It is where the consequences of federal enforcement strategy are now being tested in real time. Next slide, please. I have spent the last 30 years studying political violence, and the last 20 focused specifically on terrorism, propaganda, and state coercion. I've studied occupation-like deployments in democracies, internally in Northern Ireland and externally in Iraq and Afghanistan. My core focus has always been the same: how communities interpret coercive power, and how those interpretations shape behavior. Next slide, please. I've also worked directly with policymakers, advising the U.S. military and FBI on disruption and prevention, and advising every White House from 2001 through 2024. The central lesson from that work is simple, but often ignored. Legitimacy, when people think the government's use of force is right, fair, and restrained, is not a moral add-on. It is a strategic asset. When legitimacy holds, order holds. When it erodes, force produces resistance, not compliance. Next slide, please. Chicago is not just another city experiencing immigration enforcement. Chicago matters because it is not fringe. It is diverse, institutionally strong, and politically engaged. Under Operation Midway Blitz, Chicago has become the primary testing ground for a new model of federal power, one that blurs the line between law enforcement and political control. Minneapolis shows us what can happen when legitimacy collapses. Chicago is where we can still decide whether that happens. Next slide, please. Let me be explicit about what this testimony is not. It is not anti-enforcement. It is not anti-border control. It does not minimize crime, and it does not predict mass uprising. Those claims are distractions. This testimony is about preventing escalation, not excusing disorder. Next slide, please. My testimony argues that the conditions that historically precede tragedy are now present, even if no one intends tragedy to occur. I am not claiming that federal agents intend harm or that this tragedy is inevitable. What my research shows across democracies is that certain conditions reliably precede tragedy. Those conditions are present here. The danger is not bad intentions. The danger is predictable dynamics once legitimacy erodes. Now, what do I mean by legitimacy? Legitimacy is not popularity. It is whether people believe the state is exercising power fairly, with restraint, and with accountability. Legitimacy is not about liking the government. It is about believing that the government is using force to protect you rather than to protect itself. That's what keeps order in democracies. Next slide, please. My testimony will show why occupation is a reasonable interpretation of events. Now, I'm not arguing that Operation Midway Blitz is illegal per se. I am saying that its scale, tactics, and political context are transforming how federal enforcement is interpreted, and that those interpretations are reasonable, not hysterical. Occupation is not defined by uniforms or troop labels. It is defined by the perceived intent, whether force is seen as enforcing neutral law or imposing political control over a population. That judgment is made by communities, not by the state. In fact, this is what we teach our military before sending them into conflict zones. Army Field Manual FM 3-24 on counterinsurgency explicitly tells our troops that unrestrained uses of force in civilian areas are the key mistakes that create a powerful sense of illegitimacy among the local population before it erupts into resistance. These lessons are not deductive or based on academic judgments. They are the lessons learned in Vietnam, relearned in Baghdad and Kabul, and now being learned yet again in Chicago and Minneapolis. Next slide, please. To understand the risk, we need to understand the operation itself, not rhetorically, but empirically. Next slide, please. Operation Midway Blitz represents a 10-fold increase in federal immigration enforcement personnel on the ground. Before the operation, about 65 total enforcement agents operated in Chicago. During the Blitz, that number rose to 600. This includes 300 immigration, customs, and enforcement, and 300 Customs and Border Patrol agents. Overall, it is multi-agency, it is sustained, it is citywide. This is not episodic policing. It is an enduring federal presence embedded in daily life. Next slide, please. Enforcement has also changed in substance. Prior to Operation Midway Blitz, the number of non-felony detentions, individuals with no serious criminal convictions, was relatively few. Once the operation began, however, the data shows, data from ICE, a dramatic rise in non-felony detentions. This matters because legitimacy depends not just on force, but on whether the force appears proportionate and targeted. Next slide, please. Now let's go deeper. The impacts of this operation fall into 4 dimensions: scale and saturation, militarized optics, loss of local control, and disruption of everyday life. None of these factors alone cause escalation. Together, they shape how power is interpreted. Next slide, please. Altogether, there have been over 284 enforcement events in Chicago during Operation Midway Blitz. These raids blanketed major parts of the city. When enforcement becomes the atmosphere rather than episodic, what residents experience is not policing, but control of civic space. This is not a moral judgment. It is how human beings respond to persistent, coercive presence. Next slide, please. Tactical gear, armor vehicles, surprise residential raids, crowd control tools deployed in neighborhoods. These are factual descriptions, not exaggerations, and they matter. Now, I'm not suggesting that tactical gear is illegal, immoral, or even unnecessary in some circumstances. The danger here is not bad intentions. The danger is predictable dynamics once legitimacy erodes. Next slide, please. In every case we've studied, Northern Ireland, Iraq, Afghanistan, and in many cases here in the United States, citizens infer intent from appearance, not internal policy memos. Optics are not superficial. They are how ordinary people decide whether force is protecting them or controlling them. Next slide, please. Local political control is highly important to people. It is how they have confidence in how their cities are governed and how they will lead their lives. Yes, people may complain about their local leaders, but that doesn't mean they want outsiders to choose them. Chicagoans are acutely sensitive to this dimension. When force operates above or against elected local institutions, legitimacy erodes faster. Occupation is experienced most strongly when residents see power acting without consent or coordination. Next slide, please. Operation Midway Blitz literally reshaped daily routines of vast numbers of people in Chicago. School attendance dropped abruptly. Businesses shortened hours and lost significant revenue. Clinics and churches became sites of fear. These are real changes in people's lives, not TikTok videos. When disruption becomes collective, enforcement stops feeling targeted and starts feeling political. Next slide, please. Across uses of force by democracies, when you see such massive intrusion into local communities and disruptions to the daily lives of their residents, we see the same three-step pattern: enforcement event, spontaneous protest, suppression. This is not theory, this is empirical reality. Next slide, please. We can see this three-step process in Operation Midway Blitz. The security forces launch a surprise raid in a community. The community sees longtime residents seized. Spontaneous protests erupt. These protests are not centrally organized. They're immediate, local, reactive. This is a key sign of fear and stress, not criminal conspiracy. Next slide, please. Then the security forces react, typically out of fear themselves, to nip protests in the bud before they grow. However, suppression often produces collateral harm to bystanders, families, and children. That collateral harm is politically catalytic. Even when unintended, fear and anger grow. Next slide, please. These are not isolated incidents. There have been at least 48 spontaneous protests, 17 chemical agent deployments in residential neighborhoods. Patterns, not anecdotes, drive fear, anger, and escalation. Spontaneous, uncoordinated protests and declining cooperation with authorities are standard behavioral indicators of losing legitimacy. That's how we track it in the middle. When people fear that the government is harming them, not protecting them. Next slide, please. These dynamics are not driven by criminal intent. They are driven by perceived illegitimacy. On October 18th, as we all saw, 250,000 Chicagoans protested virtually without incident. It's the perception that matters. And that perception is not noise. It's the reality through which authority stabilizes or collapses. Next slide, please. Now I want to discuss how the federal government frames enforcement. This discussion is not about assigning blame. It is about how rhetoric raises the emotional and moral stakes of enforcement. Today, enforcement is increasingly presented in ways that encourage an interpretation of occupation rather than diminish it. Extensive research shows that such framing shapes emotional responses by ordinary people before the facts are even processed cognitively. Next slide, please. The most important framing comes from the president, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. On September 30th, President Trump told all 800 generals and admirals, and I'm quoting, "The Democrats run most of the cities that are in bad shape. We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military. We are going into Chicago very soon. I say they spit, we hit." End of quote. When national leaders frame enforcement as a righteous battle against political enemies, they raise the stakes of every encounter. This is true regardless of party. Moralized power lowers restraint. Next slide, please. DHS rhetoric routinely moralizes immigration enforcement as moral struggle, not administrative law. ICE heroes versus enemies from within, linked to identity conflicts, not legal violations. To be sure, moralizing rhetoric mobilizes supporters, but it also reduces inhibition. This is how cycles begin and accelerate. When enforcement is framed as an existential struggle, a war for the soul of the nation, citizens do not respond like people receiving parking tickets. They respond like people who believe political control is being imposed. And that shift, historically, is where restraint begins to collapse. Next slide, please. Narrative does not cause escalation by itself. In polarized America, polarized narratives amplify perceptions that force is being used to impose political control rather than neutral rules. This powerfully shapes how enforcement is interpreted. And interpretation, not legality, drives civilian response. Next slide, please. Another aspect of narrative is how officials describe public events. When officials deny visible facts, credibility erodes. We have just seen a vivid example in Minneapolis. On multiple points, there are gaps between public statements by DHS and the evident reality. This example also shows what legitimacy is all about. These are not minor misstatements. They go to the heart of restraint in the use of force by the state. The government appears to be protecting itself, not the public. Democracies don't fail when laws are enforced. They fail when enforcement loses legitimacy and people stop believing restraint will protect them. That is why Minneapolis is a crisis for the nation. Next slide, please. What happened in Minneapolis was not a one-off. In Operation Midway Blitz, Miramar Martinez was shot 5 times and was accused of intentionally ramming her vehicle into ICE agents. The facts did not stand up to the charge, and federal prosecutors later dropped all charges. But she had still been shot. When credibility erodes, legitimacy follows, especially when dealing with lethal uses of force by the state. Next slide, please. Another vivid example is the DHS claim that Operation Midway Blitz targets the worst of the worst. However, ICE's own data shows that 97% of people detained in the operation did not have a violent criminal conviction. A series of reality gaps severely erodes credibility and legitimacy because ordinary people see the pattern. Next slide, please. Given the dimensions of Operation Midway Blitz and the political framing by President Trump and DHS, it's not surprising that many Chicagoans find the language of invasion or military occupation a reasonable interpretation of these events. To be clear, what counts as an occupation is not the number of troops on the ground or whether the federal government calls it an occupation. The occupiers never call it an occupation. What counts is whether the local community believes the operations are about exerting political control. Our representative survey of the residents of Chicago show this is in fact the case. Citywide, residents interpret federal intent as political control, not neutral enforcement. For city residents, 54% see Operation Midway Blitz as a Republican president seeking political control over Democratic areas. I don't have the crosstabs here, but if you saw the crosstabs, 36% of Republicans in the city agree with this interpretation. Next slide, please. These attitudes are not limited to one neighborhood. There are no major differences across zones of the city. This is how occupation crises form, quietly, from a sense of illegitimate loss of political control and disruption of daily life before they erupt. Next slide, please. Rising fear and anger do not automatically produce violence, but they shorten the fuse, and they make restraint on all sides more fragile. This is not radicalization. What you are seeing is a response to illegitimacy. Next slide, please. Presidential authority depends not only on legal power, but on perceived legitimacy across political lines. When federal force operates without credible oversight, transparency, or restraint, legitimacy erodes, not just among political opponents, but across a broad swath of Americans. This is not a Democratic concern. It's not a Republican concern. It is a national concern. When legitimacy weakens, enforcement generates resistance, not compliance. Next slide, please. Mass protest is not democratic breakdown. It is democracy in action. But history is clear. Protest expands coalitions only when it remains overwhelmingly peaceful. Once violence enters, legitimacy collapses. Coalitions fracture, executive power hardens rather than constrains. Peaceful protest builds democratic power. Violence dissolves it. Next slide, please. The 1960s offer a warning. The civil rights movement achieved amazing gains in 1964 and 65 with a peaceful movement. Then Vietnam and the draft mobilized millions of Americans across race, class, and party, but sustained political violence in the late 1960s, including right here in downtown Chicago in 1968, prevented the civil rights and anti-war movements from converging. The result? Political fragmentation, executive escalation, law and order backlash. That risk exists again. Restraint, transparency, and accountability are not concessions. They are the path to democratic stability. Next slide. Minneapolis shows the cost of losing legitimacy, not where Chicago has to end up. 5 years ago, George Floyd exposed a crisis of racial justice and policing. Minneapolis today exposes a broader national crisis. This moment is about First Amendment protest rights, boundaries on state use of force, the relationship between federal power and American cities. These are concerns that resonate across parties, across ideologies, across identities. This crisis expands the audience and the stakes for Chicago and the nation. Next slide, please. Lawful authority and legitimacy are not the same thing. Authority is about whether government has power to act. Legitimacy is about whether people believe the government's use of power is right and fair, to protect them, not just partisan interests. This is why people accept it. To explain this, think about the difference between a firefighter breaking down your door and a masked stranger with a gun doing the exact same thing, even if the stranger says, I have authority and I have a right to be here. The force is identical in both cases. The damage is identical, breaking down the door. But you don't fight the firefighter, you step aside because you believe the force is being used for you, to protect you, not to control you. Authority alone doesn't create compliance. Belief in protection does that. That belief is legitimacy. And the moment people stop believing state force is protecting them, even if it's lawful, they begin to resist. Next slide, please. Legitimacy is a strategic asset, not just a moral add-on. It is crucial when it comes to the use of force by the state, and it is preserved through restraint, transparency, and accountability, not escalation. Time limits on force preserve proportionality. Narrowing the scope reduces disruption. Oversight restores trust. These are not concessions. They are investments in democratic stability. Next slide, please. Preserving legitimacy is the only sustainable path forward. This moment for Chicago, Minneapolis, and the country will not be resolved by escalation. It will be resolved by restraint, transparency, and accountability. Peaceful protest is democracy in action, but it only succeeds when leaders actively encourage restraint alongside accountability. What happens in Chicago will not stay in Chicago. Thank you. I'll be delighted to answer your questions.
Professor Pape explained that the administration's falsehoods about crime, justifications for using force, and terrorism, labels applied to ordinary civilians, and are part of a consistent pattern to justify violence and justify local occupation. Mass enforcement operations require public narratives to sustain them, and when those narratives are false, the operation does not self-correct. It doubles down, and it loses legitimacy in the process. The Commission takes from this testimony a critical insight. Accountability begins with truth. We cannot address what we refuse to name. The floor is now open for Commissioner questions to Professor Pape. Judge Castillo?
Yes, let me make sure this is on.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. First question is relatively simple. Have you been compensated at all for the preparation of your testimony and the time here that you've spent today?
No, not at all. Nothing, not even for the survey, nothing here. This is all coming out of our CPOS budget at the University of Chicago. And it's been stuff we worked on well before coming to the testimony, as you can tell.
Thank you for your testimony. You noted the manner of the occupation, the full military dress. What about the fact that these officers are masked? How does that factor in?
Well, if you take my example of the firefighter breaking in your door and the masked stranger, I think that helps to capture and put this in a context ordinary people can understand. I think the problem here, sir, is that too many legalisms are being bandied about. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so maybe that's why I don't like them, but the truth is I also study this with behavior. My task for 30 years has been to understand the behavioral consequences, and they don't come from the legalisms. They come from things like the perception. The mask, of course, is building a perception that the state doesn't want to be truthful about its use of force. It's hiding its use of force. So right on the face of it, it is a major problem for legitimacy.
I think we have time for one more question from the commission. Thank you, Professor Pape.
Absolutely.
Now we'll move on to the next witness. We now turn to a different set of questions. How did our institutions get to this point? How did America's standard immigration enforcement apparatus morph into the paramilitary force it is today? And what happened to the internal accountability mechanisms that once constrained abuse within DHS? Our next two witnesses will answer these questions, first from the outside, then from the inside. Garrett Graff is a historian and journalist who has extensively documented the evolution of ICE and CPB for over 2 decades. He is an acclaimed author of several books and the popular newsletter Doomsday Scenario. Mr. Graff's testimony will be focused on the following topic: from the border to the mainland, the transformation of America's immigration apparatus into a paramilitary force. Mr. Graff will place Operation Midway Blitz and ongoing immigration enforcement activities in a historical context. He will explain how these agencies grew, what happens when enforcement bodies scale rapidly, and why past surges in hiring, budget, and authority have consistently produced misconduct and loss of institutional control. His testimony will show that what we are witnessing is not an aberration, but part of a purposeful plan, and to create an enduring domestic paramilitary force. We are also joined virtually with Deborah Flyshaker, who served in the Department of Homeland Security for over 14 years under Republican and Democratic administrations. This includes as DHS's executive secretary, the acting chief of staff at ICE, and as an attorney in the DHS Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. She knows what rule-bound enforcement look like and will share her concerns about the impact of its dismantling. The topic of her testimony is Rule-Bound No More: How DHS Enforcement Lost Its Internal Constraints. But first, the Commission is prepared to accept the testimony of Mr. Garrett Graff.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me today. As a Vermonter, it's nice to come south to warm up. I'm honored to be here today to speak about the historical challenges and problems with the Department of Homeland Security and 2 of its largest components: Customs and Border Protection, CBP, which includes the Border Patrol, and the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, commonly known as ICE. I'm a journalist and historian. I've written multiple books focused on federal law enforcement, national security, and American government, one of which, about Watergate, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History, and published dozens of articles in places like Politico, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic about DHS, the Justice Department, and federal law enforcement, including the FBI, CBP, and ICE. My testimony today draws upon that extensive previous reporting and is informed by literally hundreds of conversations with agents and executives at all levels of federal law enforcement, including scores of interviews with agents and officers of ICE and CBP. I've interviewed CBP commissioners and ICE directors in their executive suites, been on patrol with the Border Patrol, ridden on their boats, and flown in their helicopters. shared meals with union officials, and been in the studio while they recorded their popular podcast, and observed as Border Patrol apprehended migrants crossing the Texas-Mexico border. My goal today is to outline for the Commission some of the history of ICE and CBP, and in particular to outline what has changed and what is changing as the Trump administration floods both agencies with money from the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. What I hope you will take away from my testimony today is that the problems, abuses, scandals, and controversies involving CBP and ICE that have been on display over the last year in far too many American cities and social media feeds, from deadly shootings and agent brutality to the routine abuse of constitutional and civil rights and liberties, is entirely consistent with long identified problems in CBP and ICE that have gone ignored and uncorrected both by a generation of Congress and multiple Democratic and Republican administrations alike. These are not aberrations. These incidents are the entirely foreseeable consequence of how the nation has approached immigration enforcement since 9/11 and the creation of DHS. In particular, CBP has been likely the deadliest and certainly the most troubled federal law enforcement agency for the better part of 2 decades now. Since 9/11, the culture of ICE and CBP has meant that the agencies have been what you might call a fascist secret police in waiting, troubled agencies simply waiting for an ambitious would-be authoritarian. ICE is an agency whose recruiting and training standards are so low that other federal law enforcement agents say pejoratively that ICE is hired, quote, hired by the pound from the pound. And the paramilitary CBP especially has been uniquely callous with human life and suffers from a deeply ingrained culture of racism and misogyny, all of which is enabled by an all but unequaled and long-standing sense of impunity. CBP, the nation's largest law enforcement agency, has been plagued for 2 decades by a tidal wave of crime, corruption, and misconduct, driven by a disastrous post-9/11 hiring surge that flooded the force with thousands of agents and officers who should have never been given a badge and gun, including, as one CBP commissioner told me, even accidentally hiring members of actual drug cartels. Criminality is so rampant inside CBP that it has seen one of its own agents or officers arrested every 24 to 36 hours since 2005. CBP's misconduct scandal is so long-running that today it would be old enough to drink. In total, according to CBP's own discipline reports, over the 20 years from 2005 to 2024, the last year numbers are available, at least 4,913 CBP officers and agents have been arrested themselves, some multiple times. In 2018 alone, a single CBP employee was arrested 5 times. To put that number in perspective, the population of CBP agents and officers who have been arrested would make it roughly the nation's 4th largest police department, equal in size to the entire Philadelphia police. Indeed, for much of the 2010s and likely before and since, it appears that the crime rate of CBP agents and officers was higher per capita than the crime rate of undocumented immigrants in the United States. Before I dive into the details, I want to add an overarching caveat. None of what I'm about to say is meant to imply that everything was hunky-dory in DHS until noon on January 20th last year when Donald Trump returned to the presidency. Quite the opposite. And yet something was fundamentally different before last year. ICE and CBP managed to go about their work in such a way that didn't cause ordinary law-abiding U.S. citizens to fear for their lives. ICE or CBP agents didn't routinely operate wearing masks and deployed tear gas daily against U.S. citizens. The entire school systems of major U.S. cities didn't have to close in fear of CBP and ICE operations targeting their communities. And professional sports leagues like the NBA didn't have to cancel games because of CBP and ICE violence in their cities. Something has changed, and my hope is that this testimony will help explain what and how. First, how history plagues CBP and ICE. On September 11, 2001, immigration was the purview of the Justice Department's Immigration and Naturalization Service, while Border Trade and Travel was the responsibility of the Treasury Department's U.S. Customs Service. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks and as part of the creation of DHS and the massive reshuffling of government, both INS and Customs were broken apart. ICE brought together what was known as the Legacy INS Deportation and Detention Officers, which were renamed as what's now known as Enforcement and Removal Operations, ICE ERO, as well as the Legacy INS and Legacy Customs Special Agents to form the Homeland Security Investigations Division, ICE HSI. Other parts of INS and Customs were reshuffled into the new supposedly unified border agency of Customs and Border Protection. The green uniformed Border Patrol were in charge of patrolling the border in between legal ports of entry, while a team made up of legacy customs inspectors and USDA agriculture inspectors were combined and renamed into the blue uniformed Office of Field Operations to handle legitimate trade and travel through ports of entry like land crossings, seaports, and airports. One of the first things Congress did with the new agency was to supercharge its hiring. The agency's own studies concluded that the Border Patrol did not have operational control over 97% of the U.S. border. Altogether, the border before 9/11 was so porous that in 2000, a 3-ton American elephant named Benny appeared in a Mexico City circus, only for U.S. authorities to discover that there was no record the elephant had ever crossed the U.S. border. The plan to remedy this lack of control was audacious and remarkably ill-conceived. During the 8 years of the Bush administration, the Border Patrol surged from 9,200 agents in 2001 to some 18,000 agents, and a number that eventually peaked in the Obama administration at 21,000 agents. Add in the officers of the Office of Field Operations and the Air and Marine officers, and CBP had a gun-carrying workforce of about 45,000 agents and officers. There was plenty of evidence, even before the hiring surge, to believe it was a bad idea. Police departments in Miami, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. had all been beset by systemic misconduct scandals after they tried to grow their force rapidly in the 1980s and 90s. The Border Patrol hiring surge would be no different. The surge meant the agency had to search far and wide for increasingly less qualified candidates. The agency raised its recruiting age from 37 to 40 and regularly sent new agents through the academy and even out into the field before completing full background checks. Agents in the field pejoratively referred to the new hires as no trainee left behind. By the end of the Bush administration, more than half of the Border Patrol had been in the field for less than 2 years. This hiring surge collided with two other fundamental and foundational problems with CBP, its legal authorities and its culture. Understanding both ICE and CBP requires starting with the difference between two U.S. government job codes, known as 1811s versus 1801s. So-called GS 1801s are the federal government's street cops, the bottom ranks of law enforcement. These positions come with less training and lower educational requirements, usually only a high school degree or equivalent, as well as more limited arrest authority. All of CBP, including both the Border Patrol and Office of Field Operations, are 1801s, as are all ICE ERO officers. All of them have strictly limited arrest powers. Then there are GS 1811 positions, known as Special Agent Criminal Investigators. These are the government's detectives. Think the FBI, Secret Service, U.S. Marshals, and notably, ICE HSI officers, HSI agents. These positions usually require more work experience and a college degree and come with far more training and more broad investigative authority. This difference may seem minor, but it's incredibly important in understanding why CBP and ICE are as rogue and poorly trained as they are. For one thing, that subtle difference in job code meant that CBP was entirely set up as 1801s, which inadvertently meant that it had no authority or power to investigate wrongdoing by its own agents and workforce. To make that point more sharply, in the post-9/11 reorganization, we created the nation's largest law enforcement agency and didn't give it the power to have the internal affairs capacity that even one would expect at a mid-sized local police department. It was a key ingredient in this recipe for disaster, and one that would not be fixed until the final months of the Obama administration, more than a decade after the creation of DHS. Which brings me to the third fundamental challenge and problem with CBP, and especially the Border Patrol. Its fiercely independent and closed-rank culture and tradition, born of policing and protecting a largely unpopulated, harsh, and isolated region along the U.S.-Mexican border. The Border Patrol is culturally and traditionally something akin to what I've described as part police force, part occupying army, and part frontier cavalry. The traditional job of Border Patrol agents is hard. They often work alone or in pairs in rural, rugged terrain, with backup and help often miles and sometimes an hour or more away. Agents developed a strong tradition of frontier-style justice. Its agency motto, honor first, is as much a statement of machismo as it is about integrity. This fierce independence manifests itself in distinct areas worthy of note, which combine to make it particularly susceptible for a would-be authoritarian. Its approach to its daily work and use of force, a deep-seated institutional culture of racism and misogyny, and a pugilistic approach to national politics. This is an agency that is uniquely callous about human lives, both of U.S. citizens and migrants. It is, as best as anyone can determine, perhaps the nation's deadliest law enforcement agency. It is notoriously hard to understand federal law enforcement shootings, but since 2010, CBP agents have been involved in at least 72 deadly shootings or use of force incidents. An internal report in 2013 that the agency tried to keep secret accused agents of shooting their weapons not out of fear, but of frustration. In 2013, a report by the Police Executive Research Forum examined 67 incidents and found that too many cases do not appear to meet the test of objective reasonableness with regard to the use of deadly force. Agents are emboldened in their use of force by a sense that there will never be consequences for doing so. Roughly 96 or 97% of complaints against Border Patrol historically have gone nowhere. In fact, across a 4-year period from 2012 to 2015 that included 2,178 complaints that warranted further investigation, just 11 resulted in an agent's temporary suspension and 11 more resulted in a reprimand. Only one out of 2,178 complaints led to an agent's resignation. If you do that math, that works out to be that across the entire Border Patrol, about 3 agents a year received a formal disciplinary reprimand. If agents act like they can get away with anything, the statistics back them up. The racist and nativist roots of the Border Patrol are well known. But what is remarkable is how the seeping cultural corruption since 9/11 has taken an agency founded a century ago to enforce explicitly racist and nativist policies and managed to make it even more racist and misogynist. In 2017, CBP officers at Newark Airport set up a rape table at the New Jersey airport where they would sexually assault other officers. In 2019, ProPublica uncovered a racist Facebook group made up of some 9,500 current and former Border Patrol agents and leaders, including the then chief of the Border Patrol. As ProPublica wrote, current and former Border Patrol agents mocked dead migrants, called Congresswomen scumbuckets, and uploaded misogynistic images. This underlying racism, misogyny, and nativism has contributed to the third area of the Border Patrol's culture I'd like to address: its unusually pugilistic participation in national politics. The Border Patrol Union has particularly resisted transparency efforts and attempts to rein in use of force. When CBP announced it would recognize officer and agents who de-escalated confrontations and avoided using deadly force, the union called the new award despicable. The union has also especially carved out a unique relationship with Donald Trump since the earliest days of his presidential campaign. It was the first union to endorse Trump, later followed by ICE's union, and Donald Trump actually first wore his now signature Make America Great Again hat during a summer 2015 tour of the border initiated by local Border Patrol union officials. It wouldn't surprise any seasoned law enforcement leader doubling the size of CBP without adequate vetting, training, oversight, or management led to a host of problems, not the least of which was the stunning arrest statistics I cited earlier. In 2016, in the final months of the Obama administration, a period that actually represented the peak of reform and professionalization for CBP, an outside advisory group headed by NYPD Commissioner Bill Bratton concluded that the CBP discipline system is broken. Bratton's advisory group noted that CBP's discipline system was less rigorous for its armed officers than the TSA's discipline system was for its unarmed security screeners. Hugely elevated misconduct, crime, and corruption problems continue to dog CBP to this day. Overall, CBP's arrest and misconduct rate is 5 times higher than other federal law enforcement agencies. CBP's corruption problem was so bad that DHS leadership under Secretary Janet Napolitano ordered CBP to change its definition of corruption to downplay to Congress the breadth of the problem. U.S. law enforcement has never experienced a scandal as big, as far-reaching, destructive, and as far-lasting as the wave of corruption and criminality that has overtaken CBP and the Border Patrol since 2005. It's a story that too much of the public still doesn't know and too many policymakers still don't understand. Let me add one caveat here. It's not my goal here to paint all of CBP with a brush of misconduct, racism, and corruption. Many agents and officers are excellent, serving our nation in hard jobs in the best possible tradition. But as one female agent told Mother Jones magazine in 2024, "I was a loyal agent and employee for 27 years, and I see the good in the agency. But I can't deny that the worst I've seen has come at the hands of the agents and not the criminals we're supposed to arrest." Now let me turn my attention for a moment to ICE. In the reshuffling of DHS, ICE got the job that no one wanted. Immigration enforcement domestically is arguably the country's most fraught and unsettled policy area. For most of its roughly 20 years of existence, ICE has faced a clear problem. There are way more undocumented immigrants in the United States than Congress funded ICE to find, arrest, and deport. For many years, ICE was budgeted for around 400,000 deportations annually. ICE's ERO side has long relied upon and focused heavily on what's known as prosecutorial discretion. Under that strategy, ICE ERO mostly focused on deporting people with a so-called final order of removal, e.g. people who had exhausted all the legal process and ignored the binding decision of the immigration courts to leave the country, or people with criminal records above and beyond simply being undocumented. The much talked about murderers, drug smugglers, gang members, and human traffickers, who are always cited as the Trump administration's main targets. The strategy of discretion worked, By 2011, nearly half of the 400,000 people deported by ICE had a criminal conviction, up from only a third in 2008. That work, though, was manpower intensive, but it also meant that they were making a real difference in terms of crime in the United States. They were actually finding, arresting, and deporting the worst of the worst, while for the most part leaving the day laborers and abuelas alone to await whatever political solution to America's immigration crisis Congress could someday find. Then Donald Trump was elected president. Today, that prosecutorial discretion is out the window. Last spring, Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller set an arbitrary target of around 1 million deportations a year, which translates into immigration officers making 3,000 arrests a day. That new quota meant ICE and CBP had to abandon any pretext of targeted enforcement operations. It took too long and required too many officers. Those raids where Greg Bovino's heavily armed CBP agents stormed into Home Depot parking lots are a necessity of this new quota system because it's the low-hanging fruit of immigration enforcement. Similarly, ICE and CBP officers around the country, and particularly in targeted operations in places like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Minneapolis, are stopping, detaining, and deporting people with no criminal records who are following all legal procedures for their asylum, immigration, or citizenship proceedings. These actions aren't because any of these immigrants pose a threat to the United States. It's because they're easy pickings. And ICE and CBP have embraced quantity over quality. The terror and trauma of these arrests is the point, not the safety of the United States. That shift is reflected in how most people now detained by ICE have no criminal record. A Cato Institute roundup in November found that nearly 3 in 4 have no conviction, and just 5% have a violent criminal conviction. This is not how ICE has traditionally been used, and CBP wasn't supposed to be routinely policing the streets and cities. The Border Patrol and ICE are just not trained, prepared, or accustomed to patrolling regular America and rolling through neighborhoods, school grounds, and parking lots. Not regular police, and they don't know how to behave or navigate urban civilian environments. They don't have the muscle memory or de-escalation skills of dealing with innocent police. It's they lack real-world policing skills. The fact that they're instead approaching their work not as law enforcement, but as an occupation military force is clear in the language officials are using. Yesterday alone, we saw Greg Bovino give an attaboy video calling for agents to turn and burn. And Border Czar Tom Homan referred to agents deploying to Minneapolis as being in theater. This is not the mentality we want guiding or inspiring a federal law enforcement. Their poor training and sense of political impunity is contributing to and driving their arrest first and question later approach, which is the exact opposite of what you would expect in a free and democratic society. And it has had entirely predictable outcomes. ProPublica found in October that more than 170 U.S. citizens have been arrested by immigration authorities, some disappearing into ICE's apparatus for days incommunicado. Sometimes I believe that American exceptionalism, the sense that it can't happen here, are the realities of our current political life. The behavior of ICE and CBP over the last year is one such case. In any other foreign country, a U.S. reporter was writing about these raids in or Minneapolis. We wouldn't hesitate or CBP, a paramilitary force loyal to the regime, or a masked right-wing militia. And as an even larger cohort of qualified and less trained ICE and CBP officers begins to hit the streets, this is almost all certainly going to get worse. I want to focus my final section of remarks about what we can expect in the months to come as ICE and CBP together see a flood of funding that is unprecedented. In 2014, my Border Patrol reporting was titled The Green Monster. Today, we're creating something even more dangerous to our country, a masked monster of a law enforcement agency, one uniquely unsuited for its new power, authority, reach, and funding levels. This time, unlike that money for the Border Patrol after 9/11, ICE's giant new supercharged ranks will be focused not on America's borders, but on our streets, neighborhoods, and businesses. We are set as a nation to repeat every single mistake that we made after 9/11 with CBP, but worse. The goal for growing ICE with 10,000 new officers is both a larger total number than the Border Patrol tried to hire during its surge, and also represents a larger total percentage of the existing ICE force. ICE is set to receive some $30 billion in new funding for this hiring. Moreover, we should have specific fresh concern about who is applying for these new jobs at ICE and CBP, which also plans to hire thousands of new agents. Today, DHS and ICE are relying on explicitly white nationalist rhetoric and imagery in their promotion materials. As one of the first moves to revamp its training, ICE proved that it's building a Trump cult of personality as much as it's hiring for a law enforcement agency. It cut its previous 5-month training academy to just 47 days, a period chosen, according to what 3 officials told The Atlantic, because Donald Trump is the 47th president. ICE is no longer interviewing candidates before hiring them and swearing them in virtually, promising that it will catch up on background checks later. The training has already been cut at 42 days to speed getting officers into the field. Lastly, news headlines are also beginning to feel eerily familiar about what the early warning signs of CBP's tidal wave of misconduct and criminality looked like in the late 2000s. There are major warning signs that ICE's workforce has a similar misconduct problem today. Last month, a detention officer at an ICE facility in Louisiana pleaded guilty to raping a Nicaraguan detainee for months. On New Year's Eve, shot and killed a man in Los Angeles, and has been accused of allegedly whipping his sons with a belt and making racist and homophobic remarks. Again, this hiring surge is just getting started. I want to raise 2 specific new concerns that I see looming on the horizon that I've not addressed elsewhere today. First is ICE and CBP's giant investment in deployment of surveillance technologies, some of which has been leading to mistaken arrests in the field, and much of which, as currently envisioned, is not consistent with policing in a free society. ICE is extensively using data mining and facial recognition technology. In particular, it's relying upon a facial recognition app known as Mobile Fortify, and claiming that the app is the be-all and end-all of someone is in the United States. There are multiple documented instances where this app has returned false or contradictory information, and yet ICE has relied on it to make detentions and arrests. Second, I have not spoken much about ICE's detention centers. The Trump administration and ICE are in the midst of an enormously ambitious plan to double the capacity of detention facilities, from about 55,000 beds to more than 107 beds, as part of a plan to pour about $45 billion into detention. I would expect and predict that over the course of 2026, we will see this plan become the business. Let me leave you today with a final point. This doesn't change unless we demand change and make it change. The way that the funding for ICE has been allocated, it can spend that money straight through to 2029. Congress is going to have to act to turn that funding and hiring spigot off. Otherwise, this continues on autopilot for the next 4 years. The country will be long-lasting. Remember, we are 2 decades removed from the start of the CBP hiring surge, and I can still find you a news story and headline day that traces its origins back to the mistakes made at that time. We as a nation must act to change the trajectory of immigration enforcement in our country. America cannot survive as a free society if ICE and CBP continue to operate as they have over the last year, let alone as both agencies are turbocharged and empowered with more funding, more officers, more guns, and more arrests. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Graff. We are now shifting our view to what accountability looked like from the inside of the DHS. Taken together, the commission will hear testimony from Mrs. Deborah Fleischaker. Ms. Fleischaker, we
Consultant.
can't hear you. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Let me start over then. My name is Deborah Fleischaker. I'm currently the principal consultant at Blackbird Ventures, LLC. I spent nearly 14 years working in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, including more than a decade as a career civil servant in the DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. From May 2021 through November 2023, I served at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, first as the Assistant Director for Regulatory Affairs and Policy, and later as the Acting Chief of Staff. I concluded my government service as the DHS Executive Secretary and Acting Chief Privacy Officer. Thank you so much for asking me to testify today. I appreciate the seriousness with which this commission is examining immigration enforcement practices and its effects on public safety, civil rights, and community trust, particularly here in Chicago, and very much look forward to our conversation. I begin with the foundational principle that shapes my testimony. Immigration enforcement is a necessary component of a functioning immigration system. Enforcement should be targeted, careful, and respectful of civil and human rights, but there are times when arrest, detention, and removal are appropriate. My testimony today is not an argument against enforcement itself, but an account of what happens when immigration enforcement loses its internal guardrails, transparency, and accountability. When that happens, as we have all seen too well over this past year, enforcement becomes counterproductive to protecting public safety. The kind of immigration enforcement we are seeing in Minneapolis and saw in Chicago is not necessary or productive. For the past year, enforcement efforts have been driven by arrest quotas rather than public safety, performance rather than discretion. Instead of relying on the discretion of trained law enforcement officers to complete their missions in the safest manner possible, current DHS immigration enforcement operations are meant to scare non-citizens and U.S. citizens. These tactics, driven by the overarching policies set by the White House, inflame tensions and make communities and its officers less safe. What is happening in Chicago is not simply a federal policy dispute. It's a demonstration of what occurs when immigration enforcement abandons its constraints and begins operating in ways that destabilize communities rather than protects them. When I served at DHS across multiple administrations of both political parties, enforcement was far from perfect, but it was fundamentally rule-bound, deliberate, and constrained by internal guardrails. It sometimes made mistakes. It sometimes used excessive force. It sometimes made the wrong judgment calls. But operations were planned and documented. Legal standards mattered. Officers and supervisors asked fundamental questions before acting. Do we have reasonable suspicion or probable cause? Are we respecting Fourth Amendment protections? Have we considered officer safety and community impact? Is discretion more important than enforcement in this case? During the Obama and Biden administrations in particular, enforcement priorities guided officer discretion. Limited resources were focused on genuine public safety, national security, and border security threats, not on exterior sweeps like those we see today. The DHS sensitive locations policy is a clear example of the kind of rule-bound, guardrail-based enforcement I support and that used to exist. That policy limited enforcement actions at schools, hospitals, places of worship, disaster shelters, and similar locations where people access essential services or exercise fundamental rights. Its purpose was not to place anyone above the law, but to ensure that enforcement discretion was exercised thoughtfully and in a way that advanced broader governmental objectives. I worked on the sensitive locations policy helping to draft the original policy during the Obama administration, monitoring compliance and investigating alleged violations during the first Trump administration, and leading the effort to draft and implement an expanded version during the Biden administration. Throughout, the policy carefully balanced legitimate enforcement needs with community protection. Importantly, this policy did not prevent enforcement. ICE and CBP continued to make arrests every day. Officers located and apprehended their targets. They simply did so away from protected locations. It should not be controversial to say that children should be able to attend school without fear that a parent will be arrested in the carpool line, that families should seek shelter during natural disasters without fear of immigration enforcement, or that parents should be able to take sick children to the hospital. Officers respected these limits and still managed to arrest their targets. The current administration rescinded the sensitive location first week in office. It was not rescinded to improve enforcement effectiveness. Instead, it was about removing internal guardrails and amplifying fear. The rollback sent an unmistakable message to the officers and the public. Discretion and restraint were no longer valued. The harm caused by rolling guardrails has been compounded by a parallel erosion of transparency and accountability. Transparency is a cornerstone of legitimate law enforcement, particularly for agencies like ICE and CBP, whose actions have immediate and profound effects on individuals, families, and communities. Body-worn cameras are a proven tool for advancing that transparency. They protect both officers and the public by creating a record of encounters, documenting compliance with law and policy, and resolving disputes about what occurred. Across law enforcement nationwide, body-worn cameras have been shown to de-escalate encounters and reduce complaints. When paired with clear rules on activation, access, and privacy, these programs strengthen professionalism and public trust. They are not about second-guessing officers. They are about reinforcing lawful, responsible use of government power. ICE has deprioritized body-worn cameras under this administration. While ICE worked hard during the Biden administration to expand the body-worn camera program, the Trump administration has proposed cutting ICE's body-worn camera funding from $20.5 million to $5.5 million, despite a surge in enforcement activity and use of force controversies. This reduction comes at precisely the moment when transparency is most needed. It sends a clear signal that arrest quotas and community sweeps are more important. Just as transparency and enforcement can go hand in hand, accountability is not in tension with effective enforcement. In fact, it's a prerequisite for it. DHS previously maintained accountability through internal oversight offices, review processes, and professional norms designed to ensure enforcement authority was exercised lawfully and responsibly. Over the past year, that infrastructure has been recognition. Key oversight offices have been hollowed out. The DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, where I worked, and long responsible for identifying systemic problems and ensuring compliance with civil rights obligations for staff, authority, and influence. The Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman, created to surface problems and improve immigration detention conditions and outcomes, has suffered the same fate. At the same time, internal decision-making processes that once functioned as guardrails have largely disappeared. Robust legal review, civil rights consultation, cost-benefit analysis, and interagency coordination were once standard. These processes were not bureaucratic obstacles. They were safeguards that ensured decisions were lawful, proportionate, and defensible. Their erosion has left enforcement decisions increasingly insulated from scrutiny and seemingly disconnected from legal and ethical standards. The consequences of this are predictable. Without meaningful oversight, enforcement operations are driven by desired outcomes rather than careful assessments of legal authority, necessity, or harm. This increases the risk of overbroad enforcement, inconsistent application of the law, and civil rights violations. It also exposes frontline officers to greater legal and professional risk by depriving them of clear guidance and institutional support. Transparency and accountability failures also undermine enforcement effectiveness. Without internal feedback loops, DHS cannot reliably assess whether its strategies are advancing public safety, using resources wisely, or achieving stated goals. Poorly designed operations strain capacity, provoke community distrust, and invite litigation, diverting attention from genuine threats. As guardrails, transparency, and oversight have eroded, immigration enforcement has shifted from rule-bound to outcome-driven. ICE once emphasized constitutional compliance, legal standards, and professional judgment. Officers generally understood the difference between consensual and non-consensual encounters and between reasonable suspicion and a hunch. When problems arose, mechanisms existed to identify and correct them. Operations today increasingly proceed without written policy, careful planning, or substantive legal review. Leadership communicates desired headlines, and officers are expected to lead the news instead of delivering public safety results. This has transformed ICE and CBP into a de facto federal police force operating in the interior of the country, and it's been characterized by quota-driven enforcement that prioritizes volume of arrests over public safety, increasingly militarized tactics and appearances in civilian communities, broad sweeps that rely on vague criteria or outright racial profiling rather than articulated legal standards, and rapid hiring and shortened training that leave officers inadequately grounded in civil law and civil liberties. Lack of discretion combined with aggressive quotas predictably increases the incidence of excessive force, indiscriminate enforcement, and civil rights violations. Such enforcement does not enhance public safety. It erodes trust, discourages cooperation with law enforcement, redirects other law enforcement activities, robs officers of their discretion, and ultimately makes communities less safe. Immigration enforcement is a necessary piece of a functioning immigration system, but enforcement stripped of accountability, transparency, and internal constraints is dangerous. It undermines public trust, weakens public safety, and creates fear rather than security. Restoring professional standards, oversight, and transparency is not an obstacle to enforcement. It's what makes enforcement lawful, effective, and worthy of public trust. Thank you, and I welcome conversation and questions.
Thank you, Ms. Fleischaker. Taken together, Mr. Graf's and Ms. Fleischaker's testimony present a sobering reality that we must confront: a rapidly expanding, overfunded law enforcement agency that resists transparency and lacks internal accountability standards is more likely to engage in patterns of misconduct. When masked agents are acculturated to intimidate rather than de-escalate, are incentivized to make arrests over ensuring due process rights, are armed for war and placed in unfamiliar urban terrains, they're being set up to fail. And when the Ombudsman and Civil Rights Office responsible for investigating agent misconduct is shuttered, agents are given rein to act with impunity. The floor is now open to Commissioner questions for Mr. Graff and Ms. Fleischaker. Yes, Commissioner?
Thank you. Mr. Graff, thank you for your testimony. It is really sobering and scary listening to the statistic that you have cited. My question to you is, there is the goal of 1 million deportation a year from this current administration, and that's a quota at this point. And there is an increase in terms of the budget for that. But did you look at some statistic in terms of immigration judges? Because immigration judges are, they're being reduced substantially. And I guess it goes with the effort of not giving anybody any due process.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, that's actually, I think, to me, a particularly telling part of how this administration is pursuing this immigration strategy, which is it is clear that the goal of meeting 1 million annual deportations is to be done outside of the normal due process that we would expect these cases to use and rely upon. That one big beautiful bill, which we have talked about, that includes funding for 10,000 new officers, 45 billion for new detention facilities, a doubling of those detention facility beds to 110,000, only included funding for 100 new immigration judges, taking the total number of immigration judges from just 700 to 800. What that says to me, when you look at the scale of the increase in arrests, detention facilities, et cetera, is that the administration has no intention of relying upon legal due process and for the migrants it is seeking to arrest and deport. Combine that with the fact that detention facilities that run by ICE are intended to be civil facilities and not criminal prisons. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. When we see the administration building them, though, we see them stressing how terrible and Spartan these environments will be, naming them things like Alligator Alcatraz. What that says to me is that the goal of these facilities is not a humane detention facility while a normal due process plays out in the courts. It's that these facilities are being built as punishment camps and are being intended to be experienced as concentration camps, so terrible that the immigrants and migrants who are sent there will waive their due process in order to speed their own deportation and expulsion from the United States. And I think as a free and democratic society, that to me is one of the most troubling aspects of the way that we are likely to watch this story unfold over the course of the next year or two.
Yes. Commissioner Arce?
I have just a very basic question about the mandate and jurisdiction of CBP. When Professor Pape was giving his presentation, there was a slide that noted that there were roughly 60 ICE agents stationed in Chicago prior to Midway Blitz and 0 CBP officers. Chicago is not a border city, and neither is Charlotte or Minneapolis. Can you explain, the presence of CPB in a non-border city and whether that was the original intent after the reorganization in 2001?
Yeah, it's a great question, and as the commission looks to recommendations for possible reform focus by Congress, this to me is actually one of the top areas that I think would be worthy of national discussion and debate, which is that dating back to the 1950s, the Border Patrol has been authorized to enforce immigration law within a reasonable distance of the border. In the 1950s, the Justice Department defined reasonable distance as 100 air miles from any land or maritime border in the United States. That is a portion of the country that includes actually 213 of the 330 million Americans. It is a portion of the country that includes the entirety of almost 7 states, almost all of the nation's 10 largest cities, and notably 75% of the entire Hispanic population of the United States. And to me, it is telling that one of the things that we have seen most change in the way that CBP has been deployed in the United States is that interior enforcement in that 100-mile region up until noon on January 20th last year was primarily done at fixed or roving road checkpoints. For instance, the sort of famous Falfurrias checkpoint that CBP runs, that the Border Patrol runs in Texas, one of 3 facilities that sort of block and the main 3 arteries out of the Rio Grande Valley, about 75 miles inside of Texas. What we had not seen prior to last year was the idea of these sort of armored convoys of CBP doing interior enforcement in the United States. And I think we should be no less shocked by their presence in cities like Chicago or Minneapolis or Charlotte than we would be if we saw armored convoys of the U.S. Coast Guard deploying into cul-de-sacs in suburban neighborhoods to throw tear gas at American citizens.
I had a question. What you're describing is CPP having a pre-existing problem of a Wild West mentality, these shootings occurring. By my calculation, since September of last year, 13 people have been shot by ICE or CBP. The only difference, as you're describing it, is now we're seeing it occur in large northern cities, primarily Democratic, and now they're being videotaped, whereas in the past, these shootings were occurring across the border, usually involving Mexican nationals, not videotaped, and pretty much suppressed. Is that the case?
That's absolutely true. And when we have seen independent investigation of CBP shootings, a very large percentage of them have witness testimony and physical or forensic evidence that contradicts the stated testimony of the Border Patrol agents involved. And I think that this has a lot to do with the culture that agents are bringing into American cities, is that they are used to being able to use force in places against populations that have very little voice, who are not going to be trusted in internal investigations, and that violence unfolds in places where there are no witnesses.
Thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner Sam?
My question is for Mr. Graff. Thanks again for your testimony. It was quite sobering, and you gave us a lot of statistics that I was totally unaware about, CBP particularly. But my question is about the enhanced surveillance techniques you talked about, namely the facial recognition. I saw news reports where as you see these officers videotaping people, that some of these techniques that they're using are going to be used to label citizens domestic terrorists. Do you know, could you speak to that or how that might affect us?
Yeah, there's actually an article in the New York Times about this today that draws on really fantastic reporting that has been done by a tech news outlet known as 404 Media, looking at how ICE and CBP are deploying these data mining and facial recognition tools. What is striking to me out of the New York Times article today was protesters and legal observers in Minneapolis talking about ICE agents and CBP officers now greeting them by name on the street, which to me has no foreseeable purpose other than to intimidate and chill the exercise of protected First Amendment freedoms.
I have one final question before we go into break, and this is for Ms. Fleischaker. One of the charges of this commission is to come up with policy recommendations for how we as a nation can proceed to really repair, but also reckon with what we would like our nation to do with this very difficult conversation on immigration enforcement. So my question is regarding kind of your discussion of the guardrails that have been taken down. Beyond bringing those back, as you have seen under your career at DHS, what do you think is really called for now with regards to the new guardrails that will need to be in place to create that sense of, well, the need for transparency and accountability with regards to ICE and CPB?
Thank you for the question. I think that it's a really complicated answer, to be honest. I think that because it's made up of so many different pieces. I think at a really basic level, send Border Patrol back to the border, make sure that they're not conducting interior enforcement, which they are absolutely not trained to do. I think there are a variety of other important reforms, including making sure that they're not masked, making sure they have clear identification, ensuring that people's constitutional rights, including their First Amendment rights, are appropriately protected. I think ending these sorts of community sweeps would be very important to sort of constraining interior immigration enforcement to an appropriate level. I think one of the things that the behavior over the past year has sort of, because the Trump administration has gone so far and so maximalist on immigration enforcement, I think it has demonstrated many of the flaws of the system that have existed for a long time, but that there has not been sort of public will to fix. That applies to immigration enforcement and to the immigration system on a larger scale. I hope that these excesses point us to towards a path towards actually fixing the problems as opposed to slapping Band-Aids on them. One of the other things I will point to is that with the enormous hiring surge at ICE, one of the questions we have to face is how do we handle all of those agents that have been hired without appropriate vetting, without appropriate training, many of whom appear to have some criminal records, some white supremacist ideology, lots of problems, right? I think Mr. Graff pointed out that ICE is heading towards the same sorts of problems that Border Patrol did when it had its surge in terms of criminality and problems within the ranks. I think that the ICE issue is going to be even larger, and I think one of the things we really have to grapple with is how to handle that. I have ideas, including forcing them to reapply for jobs with actual vetting and go through actual training to the extent they are qualified for those jobs. But I think that that's one of the real open questions that I, to be honest, don't have a fulsome answer for yet.
Thank you, Ms. Flyshaker, and thank you for all those that have provided testimony so far this morning. We're going to be taking a 15-minute break and returning at 11:10. Thank you so much for your time.
There we go. Camera off right now. If it's camera off, then can we test it?
Shinder, they want to ask me questions about what
Anything.
Hold on. Hello, everyone. We are about to start the second part of the commission hearing today. If you could please return to your seats. Pape was amazing.
Okay.
Excuse me, everyone. We'd like to come back to session for the hearing, the final part of the hearing.
Yeah, so I,
Please take your seats. Thank you. Our next witness will testify about one devastating way in which we are seeing agents act with impunity in our communities through the use of force against its members. Dr. Mark Brown, who is joining us virtually today, is the academic director and lead instructor for the Excellence in Policing and Public Safety program at the University of South Carolina Joseph F. Rice School of Law. Dr. Brown began his career as a police officer in the Charleston area of South Carolina for approximately 14 years and worked as a physical techniques instructor for 5 years at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, where he trained law enforcement officers from across the country, including Customs and Border Protection agents. Dr. Brown's testimony is titled, "When Force Becomes Unlawful, Constitutional Standards and Accountability Systems." His testimony will explain the constitutional framework governing when officers may use force, and when that force crosses into unlawful territory. He will walk us through the relevant use of force legal standard, what officers are trained to understand about reasonable force, and how accountability is supposed to function when those lines are crossed. Dr. Brown has made clear that the use of force by federal officers is not ungoverned. The Constitution requires that force be objectively reasonable under the circumstances. CPP and ICE agents are among the thousands of law enforcement officers that are trained on this standard. When force exceeds that standard, it is not merely excessive, it is unlawful. The Commission notes that the accountability for unlawful force depends on functioning systems, internal affairs investigations, Inspector General oversight, federal prosecution under civil rights statutes, and civil remedies. When those systems are weakened or captured, unlawful force becomes, effectively, permitted force. The floor is now open to Commissioner. We would like to offer the testimony of Dr. Mark Brown. You can be patient with us for a second.
Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, I can't hear anybody. Oh.
Hi, can you still hear us? Can you hear us now? Now we can't hear Dr. Brown. We can't hear you. Give us. We still can't hear you. Just give us 1 second. We're going to send him a text to see if we can get him on. If we, in the interest of time, let's introduce Ms. Hallett. Professor Hallett is here with us today, and then we'll come back to Dr. Brown. There is a question that comes even before force is typically used. Who can be stopped in the first place? Under what circumstances can immigration officers detain someone, demand answers, or make an arrest? And what does Constitution say about using race or ethnicity as the basis for those decisions? Our final expert witness before Dr. Brown, Professor Nicole Hallett, will address these foundational questions and explain how recent legal developments have created dangerous ambiguity in settled law. Professor Hallett is a clinical professor of law and director of Immigrant Rights Clinic at the University of Chicago. Her work is at the forefront of protecting the rights of people and immigrants in the United States. Professor Hallett will explain the Fourth Amendment's application to immigration enforcement, what distinguishes a consensual encounter from a detention, what reasonable suspicion requires, and why every person within the United States, regardless of immigration status, has constitutional protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. She will also address the ongoing Vasquez-Perdomo litigation that has given rise to the ubiquitous Kavanaugh stops. In doing so, she will grapple with the critical question whether recent judicial statements have created a legal environment in which racial profiling has been effectively authorized in the immigration context and beyond. Her testimony is titled, Papers, Please, the Fourth Amendment, Racial Profiling, and the Law of Immigration Enforcement. With that, the Commission is prepared to accept the testimony of Professor Nicole Hallett. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good morning. So I direct the Immigrants' Rights Clinic, as was just discussed, and I have represented immigrants for over 20 years and have taught immigration law for more than 10 years. And my students and I represent clients at every stage of the immigration process, including those that are applying for asylum and other humanitarian protections, as well as those in removal proceedings that the government is trying to deport. We also represent immigrants whose constitutional rights have been violated during arrest and detention by ICE in federal litigation. I'm here today to speak to you about the important constitutional rights that all people, including immigrants, enjoy, and the troubling trends that we have seen during Operation Midway Blitz and across the country since January 2025. So first things first, the Fourth Amendment protects all people in the United States regardless of their immigration status. The Fourth Amendment refers to people, not citizens, and courts have consistently applied its protections to citizens and non-citizens alike. At its core, the Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. What this means varies by context. In order to arrest you for a criminal offense, an officer must have probable cause that you committed a crime. The officer can conduct a brief investigatory stop if they have reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity. In some cases, the officer must also have a warrant For instance, if an officer wants to enter your home or non-public areas of private businesses to search for evidence or arrest someone, they must have a warrant issued by a neutral decision maker, usually a judge, upon a showing of probable cause. These standards apply with equal force in the immigration context. Immigration violations are generally not criminal in nature. The penalty for committing a violation of the immigration laws is deportation, not a criminal sentence. However, federal law makes clear that ICE officers are held to the same Fourth Amendment standards as officers enforcing criminal law. They must have probable cause to make an arrest, and they must have reasonable suspicion to stop someone in order to question them. Federal law also imposes an additional requirement on officers enforcing immigration laws. Unless they have reason to believe that an individual is likely to escape before a warrant can be obtained for his arrest, immigration officers cannot make warrantless arrests. And this applies even to arrests in public places, which generally do not require a warrant for felony arrests. The line between a brief stop for questioning and an arrest is a fuzzy one. The longer the encounter continues and the more intrusive the restrictions on liberty become, the more likely a court will find that the officer needed probable cause to continue the detention. These standards are relaxed at the border. For example, Customs and Border Protection can conduct warrantless, suspicionless searches of people and property to control who and what enters the country at a port of entry. However, with the exception of O'Hare Airport, Chicago and Illinois are not near the border, and officers, including CBP officers dispatched from the border, must follow normal constitutional rules when they engage in immigration enforcement here. These standards do not apply when an individual consents to questioning and a search. Sometimes it is difficult to determine whether the individual has been seized for Fourth Amendment purposes. Whenever there is any doubt, a person can ask if they are free to leave. If they are not free to leave, the Fourth Amendment standards apply. If during a voluntary encounter, a person admits that they are present in the United States in violation of the immigration laws, that gives ICE or CBP probable cause. If they determine that that person is a flight risk, they can make an arrest without a warrant. But that was not what was happening in Chicago during Operation Midway Blitz. Instead, in case after case, ICE or CBP detained people first and asked questions later. Immigrants with legal status and U.S. citizens were among those caught up in the dragnet. How did ICE and CBP determine whom to detain during Operation Midway Blitz? Traditionally, ICE targeted individuals for arrest who had final orders of removal or had criminal histories. But that is clearly not what is happening during Operation Midway Blitz. Instead, they went on roving patrols in neighborhoods with high immigrant populations and arrested people on the street and in other public places on site. According to Greg Bovino, the former CBP commander-at-large during Operation Midway Blitz, the officers made the determination on who to arrest based on different factors, quote, different factors, including a person's appearance. In September, Bovino explained to a white Chicago Sun-Times reporter that, quote, officers ask, how do they look compared to, say, you, unquote. Can ICE and CBP use a person's race or ethnicity to establish reasonable suspicion or probable cause for an immigration violation? In the criminal context, the answer is clear. Law enforcement cannot use race as a general indicator of criminal activity. It can only use it as part of a particular suspect description. Given the Supreme Court's commitment to a colorblind constitution, you would think that rule would extend to immigration enforcement as well. But the truth is more complicated. In a 1975 case, U.S. v. Brignani-Ponce, the Supreme Court held that while race or ethnicity alone could not establish reasonable suspicion, it could be one factor justifying a stop. The court reasoned that, quote, the likelihood that any given person of Mexican ancestry is an alien is high enough to make Mexican appearance a relevant factor, but standing alone, it does not justify asking all Mexican Americans to ask if they're aliens. Importantly, however, Brignani-Ponce concerned a stop near the U.S.-Mexico border. Next year, the court made clear that the geographic location of the stop determined whether race or ethnicity could be a factor, and that, quote, different considerations would arise if, for example, relying lines on apparent Mexican ancestry at a checkpoint operated near the Canadian border. 25 years later, the Ninth Circuit went even further, concluding that while the demographics near the border might have justified the Supreme Court's decision in Brignani-Ponce in 1975, the demographics looked really different in 2000. In many counties, Hispanics made up a majority of the population. Moreover, the Ninth Circuit noted that the Supreme Court had severely limited the use of race or ethnicity in government decision-making since 1975. Given that, the court held that Hispanic appearance could no longer be used to establish reasonable suspicion for a stop. However, the Supreme Court had not had occasion to re-examine its decision in Brignani-Ponce until earlier this year. That changed when the government appealed a Los Angeles case, Noem v. Vasquez-Perdomo, that barred ICE from targeting people based on race, ethnicity, or their presence at certain job sites. Although the District Court and the Ninth Circuit had enjoined the practice, the Supreme Court stayed the lower court rulings and allowed the practice to continue. The majority did not issue an opinion explaining its reasoning, but Justice Brett Kavanaugh did write a concurrence in which he seemed to sanction racial profiling in immigration enforcement. He noted that, quote, the extremely high number and percentage of illegal immigrants in the Los Angeles area, that those individuals tend to gather in certain locations to seek daily work, that those individuals often work in certain kinds of jobs, such as day labor, landscaping, agriculture, and construction, that do not require paperwork, and are therefore especially attractive to illegal immigrants, and that many of those illegally in Los Angeles area come from Mexico or Central America and do not speak much English. Although Kavanaugh believed that these stops would be brief and perfunctory, the record was replete with stories of people who had been tackled, beaten, zip-tied, and held for hours or days before being released. 2 years after the Supreme Court forbade the use of race in college admissions, it held that Hispanic citizens had to bear the risk of unlawful detention and arrest because of the apparently all-important goal of immigration enforcement. ICE has interpreted the Supreme Court's decision as permission to engage in blatant racial profiling. The Commission will undoubtedly hear stories of just a few of the people that ICE arrested during Operation Midway Blitz, who were walking down the street, minding their own business, and who came under suspicion solely because of their skin color or accent. These, quote, Kavanaugh stops, as they've now come to be called, are traumatizing for those that experience them and instill fear in immigrant and minority communities who know that they are going to become targets. There is some indication that Justice Kavanaugh may regret his opinion in Vasquez-Perdomo. In an unrelated case concerning the National Guard in Chicago, Kavanaugh added a footnote to his concurrence that seemed to walk back his decision in the case. Officers, he said, must not make interior immigration stops or arrests based on race or ethnicity. It is hard to square this statement with Kavanaugh's concurrence in Vasquez-Perdomo. Perhaps Kavanaugh is simply reaffirming the rule in Brignani-Ponce that race or ethnicity cannot be the sole factor justifying a stop. Perhaps the word interior is doing some work here, though Los Angeles County, where Vasquez-Perdomo arose, is over 100 miles from the border. Perhaps Kavanaugh wanted to clarify that while brief investigatory stops could be partly predicated on race, longer detentions or arrests cannot be. We don't know what he meant, and it may be a while before we find out. It may be a year or more before a racial profiling case lands on the court's merits docket, and even longer before we get a decision. And Kavanaugh's concurrence was not signed onto by any other justice. The other members of the majority silently signed on to ICE's racial profiling campaign without explaining their reasoning. Meanwhile, ICE and CBP's abuses continue. For example, in October, Maria Greeley, a U.S. citizen, was surrounded, seized, and zip-tied by 3 ICE masked agents without cause or warning and interrogated for an hour in Chicago. When she gave the agents her American passport, which she was carrying out of fear that she would be targeted, the agents said that she, quote, didn't look like a Greeley. Perhaps there were other factors that led ICE to target her, or perhaps Kavanaugh's concurrence in Vasquez-Perdomo emboldened ICE to engage in blatant racial profiling. And there are further signals that DHS intends to push its authority even further. Recently, a memo was leaked that argued that ICE does not need a judicial warrant to enter a home to arrest someone with a final order of removal. If the Supreme Court were to agree, it would leave all of us vulnerable to home raids. If ICE can decide on its own initiative, without approval from a judge, that it has the right to enter your home, then the Fourth Amendment is a dead letter. These are scary times, but we are not without recourse in protecting ourselves and our neighbors. Although J.D. Vance has claimed that ICE and CBP have absolute immunity when engaged in immigration enforcement, this is simply not the case. Officers can be prosecuted for violating people's rights, and in certain circumstances, they can be held civilly liable as well. We should encourage people to file damages claims to hold DHS accountable and to force the courts to clarify the law. We can also make sure that everyone knows their rights before they have a confrontation with an immigration officer. We all have the right to remain silent. No one is required to reveal their immigration status to an officer. We can refuse to give voluntary consent for searches, and we can ask for a judicial warrant before allowing ICE to enter our home. We can do these things even though ICE may not respect our rights, may arrest us for the way we look, may try to break down our door without a warrant, and may treat our silence as evidence of wrongdoing. Finally, for those of us who are unlikely to be targets of immigration enforcement based on the way that we look, we can follow the brave examples of the people in Minneapolis, Chicago, and other cities and bear witness to what is happening. We can observe and record ICE enforcement actions. We can report on what is occurring, both in real time by blowing whistles or announcing ICE's presence, and afterwards by sharing videos and speaking to the news media. All of these activities are protected by the First Amendment, despite ICE's statements to the contrary. Immigrants are vulnerable to abuses by government authorities. They often are unfamiliar with our legal system and their rights. They may not speak English and may have other vulnerabilities as well. After they are arrested, they are not entitled to appointed counsel like criminal defendants are, and they may have to navigate the immigration process without an attorney. And in many cases, the government attempts to deport people before they can vindicate their rights. It is incumbent on all of us to do what we can to protect our neighbors, not only because immigrants are entitled to the protection of our Constitution, but also because a Constitution that does not protect everyone will eventually protect no one. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Professor Hallett reminds us of a fundamental principle. The Fourth Amendment applies to everyone on American soil. Immigration enforcement does not operate in a constitutional void. Yet we have also heard that recent litigation has introduced dangerous ambiguity. When a single jurist on the highest court in the land suggests that apparent ethnicity may be a relevant factor in stops, while insisting it cannot be the sole factor, law enforcement is granted a blank check to racially profile. Race and probability can now substitute for individualized suspicion. Agents operating in the field are free to rely on their biases, on probability over particularized facts, and the people stopped and arrested will be those who look a certain way or speak a certain language. The floor is now open to Commissioner questions for Professor Hallett. Commissioner Arce.
Professor Hallett, you commented on the recently leaked memo from ICE noting or encouraging folks to conduct raids of homes and arrest individuals without a warrant. And you mentioned the possibility that the Supreme Court may bless that stance. As it stands today, though, is it true that law enforcement cannot enter a home without probable cause, without a judicial warrant or some sort of exigent circumstances?
Yes, current law is very clear that ICE needs a warrant in order to enter a home. However, we've seen the Supreme Court go against longstanding case law in the past, and they do seem determined to give this administration very broad authority in the area of immigration. I think it's crystal clear that the Fourth Amendment requires, at the very least, a neutral judge to look at the facts and circumstances surrounding the request for a warrant. And I can't imagine any circumstance in which an ICE officer who is also making the decision to go into the house can issue that warrant and have it be compliant with the Fourth Amendment. You may wonder why the administration issued the memo, given that the law is so clear, and I think the only possible answer is that they are hoping that they get a different ruling from the Supreme Court.
Do we have any other questions for Professor Hallett? Thank you, Professor Hallett. And now I would like to reintroduce Dr. Brown. I hope that he can hear us loud and clear. Thank you for your patience. I invite Dr. Brown to come back, and his testimony is titled, "When Force Becomes Unlawful, Constitutional Standards and Accountability Systems." His testimony will explain the constitutional framework governing when officers may use force and when that force crosses into unlawful territory. The floor is now open for Dr. Brown. We're going to try to unmute Dr. Brown.
Sorry. Good morning.
We hear you. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for your patience today.
No problem at all, ma'am. No problem at all. I appreciate you all having me. Let me begin by saying good morning and thank you for allowing me to be here. Just a quick dive into my background. So I was a policeman in the Charleston area of South Carolina for about 14 years. During that time, I began use of force training as an instructor. In 2019 until 2024, I was an instructor at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center under the Department of Homeland Security, also known as FLETC, down in Brunswick, Georgia. So I'll talk about, first, what constitutes an actual use of force. So use of force is any coercive action used by law enforcement to effect a lawful objective. In other words, using physical force to take someone into custody or effect an arrest or a detention. The main legal standard governing use of force is Graham versus Connor, a case cited out of 1989. That's one that I'll talk about later that is plastered throughout FLETC, and they refer to those commonly as Graham factors. So one of the main things that came out of that was that officers' actions must meet an objective reasonableness standard. And the court also indicated that use of force incidents shouldn't be examined through the vision of 2020 hindsight. And I want to give some explanation there. When they say 2020 hindsight, that's things that we know now that the officer may not have known then. That's not accounting for what they should have known then or did know then. And the other thing that goes into that is that we're examining that incident through the eyes of an officer on scene confronted with similar circumstances. There were, in the Graham versus Connor decision, there were four main factors that they took into account when evaluating use of force. One was severity of the crime. Two was the subject posing an immediate threat to the officers. Three, were they actively resisting arrest? And four, were they attempting to evade arrest? Now, there are some supplementary factors. There's number of suspects versus number of officers, presence of weapons, and size and ability of the suspect as opposed to the size and ability of the officer. And I want to go back to the first Graham factor, severity of the crime. That goes back to the basics of law enforcement that we teach our recruits. Where is your probable cause, or what is your reasonable suspicion for this encounter in the first place? Like, when I look at an incident, how did we get here? So how did we start this initial engagement? And to give you a practical example, for example, if we're looking at these Graham factors that I named, you have, if a subject, let's say we're fleeing from officers that had an active warrant for their arrest, it wouldn't be reasonable for an officer to deploy a taser because the subject at that point is not an immediate threat, even though they're simply attempted to evade arrest by flight. So while I was an instructor at FLETC, I trained officers in use of force and defensive tactics. So that's everything from multiple officer arrests to handcuffing to the use of the baton, taser, different force options. At FLETC, all federal agencies go through to get trained, except for the FBI and DEA, as they have their own training facilities in Quantico, Virginia. One of our key components in training wasn't just techniques, but it was also putting our trainees, our students, in scenarios, in various situations. Now they have to apply those techniques in a safe, stale environment, with us being able to evaluate what happened. So, for example, typically defensive tactics is taught in a mat room, wall-to-wall mats, soft mats on the floor, easy, to prevent injuries from falling and everything else. However, when I would train students, one of the things emphasized is, okay, we're now going to go somewhere. You're not going to work in an environment that's this open. You're going to be dealing or engaging people in parking lots, in hallways, bathrooms, living rooms. So the importance of teaching you now how to apply these things that we've taught you and how to navigate and how to work in different spaces. One of the factors we always drove home, looking at the grand factors, is that the use of force must be in proportion with the resistance that they're encountering. Other thing is that there's no catch-all statement in use of force. There's no catch-all scenario. Oh, well, I was in fear, so I did X, or oh, well, they were bigger than me, so I did Y. It doesn't work like that. It comes down to what stimulus you're receiving in the moment, but it also always goes back to how did we get there in the first place? What was the reason for our initial encounter? I think training is essential for use of force in order to keep it in compliance with the CBP officers that I trained, that I saw and I encountered, they were getting stationed at land borders, seaports, airports. They weren't, and I've had a discussion with some CBP instructors, because they would say, well, we're not street cops. We don't do patrol. We don't do daily street activities. And one of the things I saw with them as far as gaps in training is that they don't deal with crowd control. They weren't trained in crowd control and crowd management. The Uniform Police Training Program down at FLETC, they deal with crowd control as in like a typical protest or crowd management. CBP didn't receive that training. They didn't really receive patrol tactics. They did tactics in terms of clearing buildings, but not how to operate in an urban environment. One of the things, looking at the DHS policy that came down when I was there in 2023, is that it requires that it reinforces the Graham standards. And agencies that I've reviewed and use of force incidents that I've testified in, just about every agency I've seen refers to the Graham standards. In that DHS policy, the Graham standards are cited in the footnotes, or Graham versus Connor is also cited in the footnotes. So one of the main things it also cites is officers being trained in de-escalation. And when I talk about de-escalation is a tactic that reduces or eliminates the need for use of force. Because one of the things in any use of force incident, there's a risk to injury to both officer and citizen, because could be a potential physical confrontation. And again, you're not in that safe mat room environment. You're in a parking lot. You're on grass. You're in bleachers. Another thing I saw in the DHS policy, and another thing I've seen a lot of agencies discourage and prohibit is firing into moving vehicles. Reason is because if you're firing into a moving vehicle, if you neutralize the driver, incapacitate the driver, now you have a vehicle just out of control. Another thing to think about that I looked at there is that you have your, how did we get there in the first place? A lot of agencies are telling officers, for specifically the NYPD, I review their policy and training, do not try to stand in front of a vehicle to stop it. Unless you are superhuman, and most of us aren't, don't stand in front of a vehicle to attempt to stop it, because with some scenarios you've seen, officers will stand in front of vehicles, attempt to stop it, and then step out of the way and then fire shots as the vehicle goes by. But again, and when reviewing that incident, I'm always looking at, well, why, how did we get here in the first place? One of the things also I want to touch on is in deadly force, especially, we talk about imminent threat. And an imminent threat is one of those things where we can say reasonably that harm is getting ready to occur to either someone else or the officer themselves. And put that in context for you. An officer standing 50 yards away from a subject that has a knife is not an imminent threat. Is it a problem? Absolutely. Is it a concern? Definitely. But that's not an imminent threat. Now, an officer standing in the same room with a subject with a knife who's threatening to stab the officer, that is an imminent threat. And just to give you context about the difference in those. I appreciate your time, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you again, Dr. Brown. Now we are prepared to, as a commission, to receive any questions for Dr. Brown. Any questions? Commissioner Arce?
Dr. Brown, you mentioned just a few minutes ago about training with respect to how to address a vehicle with a potential suspect in it. Two parts of the question. One, is that training given at FLETC based on your experience? And then two, you mentioned some gaps in training with respect to CBP, and I'm curious if that is one of the types of training that they engaged in typically as they prepared to go out in the field.
I know that they received training. I don't think they received training in terms of traffic stops, but I know one of the main things they had training, they did not have training in crowd control or crowd management. And because again, they're not doing the typical duties that a patrol officer would do. They're in areas that are relatively or inside a fence, on a compound, on a facility where everybody that comes on has already been screened to a certain degree. So now I think asking them to go into an area, into an urban environment, is putting them at a significant disadvantage.
I have a question.
Yes, Commissioner?
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for your testimony. My question is a follow-up to Commissioner's question is, they are trained, right? They're supposed to undergo all this training. But with what you're seeing right now with ICE agents and CBP, do you believe that they are properly trained, or they've received training but have completely ignored that training?
I can answer that in two parts. One, I don't see their actions being consistent with the training that they would have received at FLETC in terms of grand factors. And then two, I think for the mission that they're currently being tasked to do, I don't think they've been trained properly for that at all. I think there is a significant gap in training, and that's creating an issue for public safety.
I think that's all the questions we have right now. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for your time today, and to all those that have provided testimony. We're going to be transitioning right now to public comment. The Commission now has helpful frameworks to better understand what we are confronting. But frameworks do not capture the human reality. As the prolific James Baldwin reminds us, If one really wishes to know how justice is administered in a country, one goes to the unprotected, those precisely who need the law's protections most, and listens to their testimony. This is from No Name on the Street. Hearing directly from the public is central to the Commission's mandate. We will now begin the public comment portion of the hearing. Here is how this portion will work today. 4 commenters have been selected through a combination of advanced signups and in-person registration today. Each speaker will have up to 2 minutes to speak. A timer will help keep us on schedule so that everyone has an equal opportunity to be heard. We as speakers to direct their comments to the Commission and to focus on their own experiences, observations, or concerns. While strong emotions are understandable, personal attacks or disruptions will not be permitted in this forum. To those who were not selected to speak today, please know that there will be additional hearings in the coming months. We can also accept any prepared written testimony in person, or we can have Commission attorneys speak briefly with people who have stories to share after the public comment period concludes. This is your Commission. Your voice matters, whether spoken today or submitted in another form. We will now begin in public comment. I would like to first welcome Jason Markey. Jason, can you join us? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jason Markey. I spent years as a U.S. history teacher before moving into school administration. Today, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not my current or former school district. I've been wrestling with a question which was reinforced by Professor Hallett's comments earlier today regarding the 14th and the 4th Amendment. If I were still teaching, how would I teach these fundamental amendments to students whose families are denied these constitutional protections by ICE today in 2026? As a reminder, these amendments date back to our Bill of Rights in 1868, respectively. As an educator, I work every day where we do not ask students or parents about immigration status. We do not verify immigration paperwork before offering them a place in our schools. That is not an oversight. It is a deliberate commitment grounded in both law and ethics. This is why I'm deeply troubled by what's happening outside of our school walls and from what I've just heard today. Federal agents now using facial recognition apps to instantly identify anyone they encounter, scanning millions of images in a database, while the agents themselves hide behind masks. They demand transparency from the people they police while operating in anonymity themselves. To paraphrase W. Edwards Deming, a system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. When we see constitutional principles applied selectively and unevenly, when families are separated without due process, when the Fourth Amendment disappears because enforcement officers choose to hide their identities, that's not dysfunction, that's design. As I understand our Constitution, due process is not a privilege reserved to the documented. It is a guaranteed that should be afforded to all people. Equal protection should not fluctuate based on status, language, or zip code. When government actors fail to uphold these principles, accountability is not political, it is essential. The work of this commission matters deeply. I urge the commission to continue this work with courage and clarity, and I thank you for creating the space for the public to learn about and speak to the real impacts of federal enforcement practices on our communities, and more importantly, to create a roadmap for a way forward. Thank you for your time and service.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. I'd like to also invite Mr. Matt Davison.
Good morning to you all, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm Matt Davison, CEO of NAMI Chicago. NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and we are the local affiliate. If someone is in the city and they're in a mental health crisis and they dial 988, in all likelihood, they're talking to one of our team members. Likewise, we operate a countywide mental health helpline for the community that is free and confidential and barrier-free, so people can reach out when they need mental health resources and when they're in mental health distress. I'm here to tell you that our data, our teams, our community work all confirm that the community is under a great amount of distress at the moment, based on the call intakes that we're getting and the amount of emotional distress that we're getting relayed from the community. You heard from Professor Pape already, phrases like fear, stress, isolation, fear to take a loved one to a medical appointment. Our proffer to this commission is that the consequences to our city's mental health right now are hard to overstate. Like all of you, NAMI Chicago is grappling with questions too. Like, what does this do to a child who doesn't get to go to school? What does it do to their friends who see an empty desk? What does it do to the adult caregiver that serves as their mom and dad's Spanish interpreter and they can't go to medical appointments anymore? And what does it do to a community who is regularly asked to trust its governmental partners? We tend to slip into talking about these events in the past tense. I would just remind the commission that's just simply not the case right now for our mental health in its present state. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davison. I'd like to now invite Ms. Amber Kirchhoff to provide comment.
Good morning, Commissioners, and thank you for the opportunity to present comment to you all today. My name is Amber Kirchhoff, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy at Thresholds. Thresholds is one of Illinois' largest and longest-serving community mental health providers, substance use treatment providers, as well as permanent supportive housing providers. And every morning, hundreds of Thresholds staff gather as teams to review their rosters of clients living with mental illnesses. They discuss each client they will see that day and what they need to support their mental well-being. Who needs help getting to a cardiologist appointment? Who might need a check-in to make sure that they have access to nutritious food? And who might need a gentle reminder to take their medication? After mapping out the day, they head into the community to connect with our clients and to deliver the care that they need. Lately, however, our staff has been heading into this work in the community gripped by fear, anxiety, and trauma stemming from the presence of ICE and federal agents. For many of our clients, the methods that ICE and federal agents are using have evoked trauma, disrupted daily life, and eroded their sense of safety and stability. The fear is real and it is harmful. And no one should have to live with that. No one should have to live in distress. Every member of our community, whether a Thresholds client or not, is a person who deserves safety, dignity, and the opportunity to thrive. At Thresholds, we are doing everything that we can to equip our staff to support our clients, to support one another, and the communities we serve amidst collective trauma. We are particularly concerned about cases concerning those living with mental illnesses who have been placed in dangerous situations by federal agents like Omar Huerta Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros is a permanent resident living with schizophrenia who was detained by ICE in Chicago. His family had no information about his whereabouts for nearly 2 weeks. Reports indicated that he was released by ICE miles away from home. I believe his family only found him due to circulated information on social media from what I remember reading. I'd also like to note that Threshold staff has provided mental health support to people gathered at the Broadview ICE detention facility at the request of the governor's office. We are proud of our team's steady presence there in assisting individuals experiencing profound trauma, including those whose loved ones are being detained. We grieve the communal trauma being inflicted on already vulnerable communities across our city, and we remain dedicated to providing home, health, and hope to all of those who are in need. I have my written comments here that I'll leave with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kirchhoff. And our final person to provide public comment today is Mr. Marty Castro.
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm Marty Castro. I am the former chairperson of the Illinois Human Rights Commission and the former chairperson of the United States Commission on Civil Rights by appointment of President Obama. While I wear a number of hats today, I'm here to speak on behalf of Allies United, a coalition that was formed in November and which has had meetings recently, a coalition of Latino, African American, Asian, Muslim, Arab, Indigenous, disabled, LGBTQ, and other communities that are currently targeted by the federal administration. We want you to know that the current environment, which is sought to divide us ethnically, racially, divide us citizen from non-citizen, is having the opposite effect in our communities. And we have come together to enforce our mutual civil rights. As you heard today from the experts, whether it's the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the 14th Amendment, ironically the Second Amendment, and our voting rights, we are coming together to ensure that we protect those peacefully. As a coalition, we ask each of you to take certain actions to ensure that your report isn't just a snapshot in time that is placed upon a shelf as a moment in history. We ask that you please consider the evidence that you have gathered and that you will gather in your roles to be referred to local law enforcement for action. Local law enforcement will be the only entities that can ensure that what we're seeing in terms of violations of laws are not presidentially pardonable. In addition, we ask you, and I know it's difficult, we've had challenges with this, when you are hosting events, and I have been fortunate a decade ago to host events as chairman of the Civil Rights Commission on police use of excessive force, as well as immigration enforcement. These are issues that are not new. To ensure accessibility, we held field hearings because we knew that immigrants, whether documented or not, and others in our community, are fearful of coming to government agencies, government buildings and facilities. So I would encourage you to, in the future, consider holding a field hearing to allow individuals who may not be able to enter government facilities or may fear doing so, have the opportunity to share their thoughts with you. And finally, a friend of ours, a member of our coalition, is here in the audience from the disabled community and has pointed out to me that today there is no closed captioning. So I would encourage you in future hearings to ensure that accessibility exists for all communities. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and thank you so much for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Castro, on that reminder about closed captioning. Again, I want to thank everyone who offered public comment today. I also want to take a moment and thank the staff of the Illinois Accountability Commission and the staff of the Illinois Department of Human Rights and many other government employees who've helped to make the hearing possible today and supported the commissioners. We know that sharing these experiences publicly is not easy, and we recognize the trust it takes to speak in this space. Your words are now part of the public record, and they will inform the Commission's work going forward. We also want to thank those who listened respectfully and attentively. Creating space for testimony is a shared responsibility. This concludes the public comment portion of today's hearing. To close today's hearing, I now turn to the program to our chair, Judge Ruben Castillo.
Thank you. And I want to thank Commissioner Tortolero, Commissioner Sam for presiding over this day. All of our commissioners will have a chance. I want to thank all of you for being here, all of our witnesses who, like us, are operating without compensation. I didn't ask that question of everyone. I think it's fair to say all of us are here since December at our last hearing, and we're upset, and we're mad, and we're sad, and we're heartbroken. There's no other way to talk about it. The events that occurred in the last couple of weeks just emphasize how important this work is. I never expected, hope against hope, that this would go to other cities. And make it plain, this began here in Illinois with the killing of Silverio Villegas Gonzalez in Franklin Park on September 12th of last year, followed by the shooting of Miss Martinez on October 4th. And then other shootings occurred, and they have continued. And today we learned that there's a history of these Wild West shootings. And the thing that has vividly changed is that all of us got to witness 2 murders in Minnesota, sadly. And I think those 2 murders speak for themselves. When you have a young woman who tells an ICE agent, "I'm not mad at you," and then gets shot 3 times in the face while the vehicle is turning away, and then you focus on the words. What did the agent say after he shot her that 3rd time? F-U-C-K, and then the word that starts out with a B to describe a female. That speaks volumes. It speaks volumes. And words matter. Words matter. And then we get to look at poor Mr. Pruddy, who then is falsely accused of setting out to massacre agents. And we know from watching that video over and over and over, and believe me, I've watched it 50 times from different angles. The only one that was massacred this week was Mr. Pruddy, as he's shot 10 times. That was a massacre. So our democracy right now is imperiled, and we can see it all playing out together. This commission will try to connect these dots. Governor Pritzker asked us today or yesterday to focus on words. And words are important because words together with actions supply motive. And when you look at the words the president has spoken, and you look at the words of people working for the president, the motives become crystal clear in terms of what is happening here. As he talked about Chicago, we will focus on every single one of those statements he made about Chicago, going back to his first administration. And it becomes clear that Chicago is definitely a target of action. And we find out what type of action by the actions of his agents who are being motivated by the manner in which they're being recruited, by their lack of training, by the words that are spoken to them coming out here. And we have some very choice words from Kristi Noem about how she wanted to be tough. And we've seen toughness. But it's one thing to talk about toughness when a team is going out there. It's another thing to talk about toughness when you're setting out a group of thugs in full military gear, masked, and go out there to do what they've done, which is just playing out violence. I could put up a video of Mr. Villegas Gonzalez being killed and compare it to the 2 shootings in Minnesota, and eventually the video of Miss Martinez will be released, and they will all compare just almost, unfortunately, sadly, perfectly in terms of what occurs. And I'm sure Mr. Graff can supply us with all kinds of other incidents going to our border with Mexico, and all of this lines up. And this is the agency that's about to get all this money to hire more agents to do this? This has to stop. I said last time, we cannot, as citizens, allow this to be the new normal. And this is what is occurring. That Mr. Villegas Gonzalez gets killed in Franklin Park on September 12th, and now other people are being killed. And what's next? Are we just going to stand around and see this happen? So I certainly second, and I think the commission will second, the idea that people need to be prosecuted. Certainly, in my days of being a judge or being a prosecutor, just like Mr. Smits or our Vice Chair, Pat Holmes, we would be prosecuting these cases. And they would not be hard to win. They would be pretty easy to win with the type of statements, the type of text messages that are sent after a woman is shot 5 times, boasting about shooting her, taking out. I would love to see the video of Miss Martinez. Probably don't want to see it, but an automatic rifle being pulled out because supposedly a car was bumped into. And we see a pattern with each of these shootings. I looked at them. The pattern is the same. The shooting occurs, and within minutes, and we're going to quantify how many minutes, because we saw this week, probably within 10 minutes, the justification for the shooting. Within 10 minutes. Domestic terrorists, that's a word that's used. If there's a vehicle, the vehicle was weaponized. These are very choice words. And then now the massacre. We need to bring this to an end. I said the very first time we had a press conference announcing that this commission would be formed, we will focus light on all this evil. And the commission intends to do that. We will just continue to do that, to document this. There appears to be no desire on the part of the Trump administration to prosecute, discipline, and I come back to that word discipline. Just imagine if the agents who shot Mr. Villegas Gonzalez back on September 12th had been publicly disciplined. Imagine a world where that had happened. Maybe, just maybe, the Minnesota shootings would not have occurred and 2 people would be alive who are now dead and their families grieving for them, let alone the trauma that is secondary trauma that's occurring with all kinds of people, including children, watching that video over and over again of a U.S. citizen being massacred on the streets. My daughter, who's a public school teacher, asked me, Dad, how can this happen in the United States of America? How can this happen? And we have to answer that question, and we will. And so I don't want to take up more of your time. I appreciate everyone being here, but I think we all think alike. What I really want to highlight is that we, as a commission, with our fine staff, have issued our preliminary report. This is just a preliminary report. You can get a copy of this. But what's important about this report is not only the words that express the sentiments of our staff and our commission, but what is important is to get your input. We need your input to make this so much better for the final report, because contained within this report are draft suggestions about what could be the recommendations. I sat here very carefully and heard a lot of good recommendations, because we are at a precipice here. We are at a point where no matter what Congress does, as Mr. Graff mentioned, this is on automatic pilot for a lot more money coming in, and we have a president who's willing to follow another nice Justice Kavanaugh suggestion to use the insurrection clause. And within minutes, President Trump was tweeting about the insurrection clause. So we're at a very important point. But when you piece this all together, as we will, when you take their prior statements, you take their arbitrary quotas, and now detaining people, some U.S. citizens, some not, some being arrested, some being just detained and then released, and then those that are detained and are arrested taken to a facility that one of my former colleagues found totally inadequate. The Broadview facility was meant to hold 15 people, 30 people max, and is now holding hundreds, if not thousands, and a reduction in immigration judges. What do we have here? It's just a system that's designed to brutalize people, send them to countries not of their origin. Of course they're going to sign what are, quote, voluntary deportations. They're not voluntary at all. Right now, this is a joke. And we're going to make vital recommendations. We're going to make recommendations to suggest that state law needs to be changed so that this does not go on. And we will have conversations with those in local law enforcement to suggest prosecutions that should be occurring even as we speak. That's where we're headed, but I cannot emphasize how much we need your input. So if you have good ideas, we need those good ideas because our final report will not come out for months. So this is just a beginning. And today is just our second hearing. We will have others that will specifically focus on Mr. Villegas Gonzalez being unfortunately killed and Ms. Martinez being shot in the manner in which he was, as well as other things that are just as important: mental health, children, economics, how this is hurting across the board. And guess what? As reported today, we're paying for all this. We're paying for the military being just on standby and for these agents to be sent here. When all of us pay our taxes on April 15th, we get to pay for this. It's a travesty, and we need to end it. Thank you for being here. And I think that concludes our hearing.
That's right. Well said, Judge.